Oh, I missed 3 heats. That's terrible. Ooh.
Country. And when the meeting was numerous, the king set forth this errand, that he desired them, according to his proposal, to allow themselves to be baptized. Then said Olmouth the Old, we relations have considered together this matter, and have come to one resolution. If thou thinkest, king, to force us who are related together to such things as to break our old law, or to bring us under thyself by any sort of violence, then will we stand against thee with all our might, and be the victory to him to whom fate ordains it. But if thou, king, wilt advance our relations' fortunes, then thou shalt have leave to do as thou desirest, and we will all serve thee with zeal in thy purpose. The king replies, what do you propose for obtaining this agreement? Then answers Olmouth, the first is, that thou wilt give thy sister Astrid in marriage to Erling Skjalgsson, our relation, whom we look upon as a most hopeful young man in all Norway. King Olaf replied, that this marriage appeared to him also very suitable, as Erling is a man of good birth, and a good-looking man in appearance, but Astrid herself must answer to this proposal. Thereupon the king spoke to his sister. She said, it is but of little use that I am a king's sister, and a king's daughter, if I must marry a man who has no high dignity or office. I will rather wait a few years for a better match. Thus ended this conference. 63. Hordelin baptized. King Olaf took a falcon that belonged to Astrid, plucked off all its feathers, and then sent it to her. Then said Astrid, angry is my brother. And she stood up, and went to the king, who received her kindly, and she said that she left it to the king to determine her marriage. I think, said the king, that I must have power enough in this land to raise any man I please to high dignity. Then the king ordered Olmouth and Erling to be called to a conference, and all their relations. And the marriage was determined upon, and Astrid betrothed to Erling. Thereafter the king held a thing, and recommended Christianity to the bonds. And as Olmouth, and Erling, and all their relations, took upon themselves the most active part in forwarding the king's desire, nobody dared to speak against it. And all the people were baptized, and adopted Christianity. 64. Erling Skjalgsson's wedding. Erling Skjalgsson had his wedding in summer, and a great many people were assembled at it. King Olaf was also there, and offered Erling an earldom. Erling replied thus, all my relations have been hers only, and I will take no higher title than they have. But this I will accept from thee, king, that thou makest me the greatest of that title in the country. The king consented. And at his departure the king invested his brother-in-law Erling with all the land north of the Saga Ford, and east to the Lidendens, on the same terms as Harald Harfager had given land to his sons, as before related. 65. Romsdal and Fjord districts baptized. The same harvest King Olaf summoned the bonds to a thing of the 4 districts at Dragside, in Stad, and there the people from Son, the Fjord districts, Southmore, and Romsdal, were summoned to meet. King Olaf came there with a great many people who had followed him from the eastward, and also with those who had joined him from Rogaland and Hordaland. When the king came to the thing, he proposed to them there, as elsewhere, Christianity. And as the king had such a powerful host with him, they were frightened. The king offered them 2 conditions, either to accept Christianity, or to fight. But the bonds saw they were in no condition to fight the king, and resolved, therefore, that all the people should agree to be baptized. The king proceeded afterwards to Northmoor, and baptized all that district. He then sailed to Hlater, in Trondheim. At the temple they razed to the ground, took all the ornaments and all property out of the temple, and from the gods in it. And among other things the great gold ring which Earl Hakon had ordered to be made, and which hung in the door of the temple. And then had the temple burned. But when the Bonds heard of
Hey
this,
man,
they
Blood
sent
Wolf,
out a
what's
war
going
arrow
on,
as
bro?
a token through the whole district, ordering
Return
out
us
a
all.
warlike force, and intended to meet the king with it. In the meet.
What's up, brother? How you doing? Ooh. Shoot, I gotta try that. They already gone. Oh, dang it. Ruined my day. What the hell?
it. In the meantime, King Olaf sailed with a war force out of the fjord along the coast northward, intending to proceed to Halagoland and baptize there. When he came north to Bjarnor, he heard from Halagoland that a force was assembled there to defend the country against the king. The chiefs of this force were Harik of Jada, Thor Hojord from Vakar, and Evin Kinrifa. Now when King Olaf heard this, he turned about and sailed southwards along the land. And when he got south of Stad, proceeded at his leisure, and came early in winter, AD 998, all the way east to Viken. 66. Olaf proposes marriage to Queen Sigrid. Queen Sigrid in Svitjod, who had for surname Haughty, sat in her mansion, and during the same winter messengers went between King Olaf and Sigrid to propose his courtship to her, and she had no objection. And the matter was fully and fast resolved upon. Thereupon King Olaf sent to Queen Sigrid the great gold ring he had taken from the temple door of Later, which was considered a distinguished ornament. The meeting for concluding the business was appointed to be in spring on the frontier, at the Got River. Now the ring which King Olaf had sent Queen Sigrid was highly prized by all men. Yet the queen's goldsmiths, 2 brothers, who took the ring in their hands, and waited, spoke quietly to each other about it, and in a manner that made the queen call them to her, and ask what they smiled at. But they would not say a word, and she commanded them to say what it was they had discovered. Then they said, "The ring is false." Upon this she ordered the ring to be broken into pieces, and it was found to be copper inside. Then the queen was enraged, and said that Olaf would deceive her in more ways than this one. In the same year, AD 998, King Olaf went into Ringgenk, and there the people also were baptized. 67. Olaf Haraldsson baptized. Asta, the daughter of Gudbrand, soon after the fall of Harald Grensk, married again a man who was called Sigurd Syr, who was a king in Ringerike. Sigurd was a son of Halfdan, and grandson of Sigurd Raz, who was a son of Harald Harfager. Olaf, the son of Asta and Harald Grensk, lived with Asta, and was brought up from childhood in the house of his stepfather, Sigurd Syr. Now when King Olaf Tryggvason came to Ringerike to spread Christianity, Sigurd Syr and his wife allowed themselves to be baptized, along with Olaf their son. And Olaf Tryggvason was godfather to Olaf, the stepson of Harald Grensk. Olaf was then 3 years old. Olaf returned from thence to Viken, where he remained all winter. He had now been 3 years king in Norway, AD 998. 68. Meeting of Olaf and Sigrid. Early in spring, AD 998, King Olaf went eastwards to Konungahela to the meeting with Queen Sigrid. And when they met, the business was considered about which the winter before they had held communication, namely, their marriage. And the business seemed likely to be concluded. But when Olaf insisted that Sigrid should let herself be baptized, she answered thus, "I must not part from the faith which I have held, and my forefathers before me. And, on the other hand, I shall make no objection to your believing in the God that pleases you best." Then King Olaf was enraged, and answered in a passion, "Why should I care to have thee, an old faded woman, and a heathen jade?" And therewith struck her in the face with his glove which he held in his hands, rose up, and they parted. Sigrid said, "This may some day be thy death." The king set off to Viken, the queen to Svitjod. 69. The burning of warlocks. Then the king proceeded to Tunsberg, and held a thing, at which he declared in a speech that all the men of whom it should be known to a certainty that they dealt with evil spirits, or in witchcraft, or were sorcerers, should be banished forth of the land. Thereafter the king had all the neighborhood ransacked after such people, and called them all before him. And when they were brought to the thing, there was a man among them called Evin Kelda, a grandson of Ragnvald Redelbein, Harald Harfager's son. Evin was a sorcerer, and particularly knowing in witchcraft. The king let all these men be seated in one room, which was well adorned, and made a great feast for them, and gave them strong drink in plenty. Now when they were all very drunk, he ordered the house be set on fire, and all the people within it were consumed, all but Evin Kelda, who contrived to escape by the smoke hole in the roof. And when he had got a long way off, he met some people on the road going to the king, and he told them to tell the king that Evin Kelda had slipped away from the fire, and would never come again in King Olaf's power. but would carry on his arts of witchcraft as much as ever. When the people came to the king with such a message from Eyvind, the king was ill pleased that Eyvind had escaped death. 70. Eyvind Kelda's death. When spring, AD 998, came, King Olaf went out to Viken, and was on visits to his great farms. He sent notice over all Viken that he would call out an army in summer, and proceed to the north parts of the country. Then he went north to Actor. And when Easter was approaching, he took the road to Rogaland with 300, equals 360, men, and came on Easter evening north to Egvald, in Kormt Island, where an Easter feast was prepared for him. That same night came Eyvind Kelda to the island with a well-manned longship, of which the whole group consisted of sorcerers and other dealers with evil spirits. Eyvind went from his ship to the land with his followers, and there they played many of their pranks of witchcraft. Eyvind clothed them with caps of darkness, and so thick a mist that the king and his men could see nothing of them. But when they came near to the house at Egvald, it became clear day. Then it went differently from what Eyvind had intended, for now there came just such a darkness over him and his comrades in witchcraft as they had made before, so that they could see no more from their eyes and from the back of their heads, but went round and round in a circle upon the island. When the king's watchmen saw them going about, without knowing what people these were, they told the king. Thereupon he rose up with his people, put on his clothes, and when he saw Eyvind with his men wandering about, he ordered his men to arm, and examine what folk these were. The king's men discovered it was Eyvind, took him and all his company prisoners, and brought them to the king. Eyvind now told all he had done on his journey. Then the king ordered these all to be taken out to a skerry which was underwater in flood tide, and there to be left bound. Eyvind and all women left their lives on this rock, and the skerry is still called Skratasker. 71. Olaf and Odin's apparition. It is related that once on a time King Olaf was at a feast at the Sigvald, and when eventide there came to him an old man very gifted in words, and with a broad brimmed hat upon his head. He was one-eyed, and had something to tell of every land. He entered into conversation with the king, and as the king found much pleasure in the guest's speech, he asked him concerning many things, to which the guest gave good answers, and the king sat up late in the evening. Among other things, the king asked him if he knew who the Oswald had been who had given his name both to the miss and to the house. The guest replied that this Ogfold was a king, and a very valiant man, and that he made great sacrifices to a cow which he had with him wherever he went, and considered it good for his health to drink her milk. This same King Ogfold had a battle with a king called Farin, in which battle Ogfold fell. He was buried under the ground close to the house. And there stands a stone over him, and close to it his cow also is laid. Such and many other things, and ancient events, the king inquired after. Now, when the king had sat late into the night, the bishop reminded him that it was time to go to bed, and the king did so. But after the king was undressed, and had laid himself in bed, the guest sat upon the footstool before the bed, and still spoke long with the king. For after one tale was ended, he still wanted a new one.
Damn.
Then the bishop observed to the king, it was time to go to sleep, and the king did so. And the guest went out. Soon after the king awoke, asked for the guest, and ordered him to be called, but the guest was not to be found. The morning after, the king ordered his cook and cellar master to be called, and asked if any strange person had been with them. They said that as they were making ready the meat, a man came to them, and observed that they were cooking very poor meat for the king's table. Whereupon he gave them 2 thick and fat pieces of beef, which they boiled with the rest of the meat. Then the king ordered that all the meat should be thrown away, and said this man can be no other than the Odin whom the heathens have so long worshipped. And added, but Odin shall not deceive us. 72. The Queen of Trondheim. King Olaf collected a great army in the east of the country towards summer, and sailed with it north to Nidaros in the Trondheim country. From thence he sent a message token over all the fjord, calling the people of 8 different districts to him. But the bonds changed the king token into a war token, and called together all men, free and unfree, in all the Trondheim land. Now when the king met the thing, the whole people came fully armed. After the king was seated, the king spoke, and invited them to adopt Christianity. But he had only spoken a short time when the bonds called out to him to be silent, or they would attack him and drive him away. "We did so," said they, "with Hakon Foster, son of Athelstan, when he brought us the same message, and we held him in quite as much respect as we hold thee." When King Olaf saw how incensed the bonds were, and that they had such a war force that he could make no resistance, he turned his speech as if he would give way to the bonds, and said, "I wish only to be in a good understanding with you as of old. And I will come to where ye hold your greatest sacrifice festival, and see your customs, and thereafter we shall consider which to hold by." And in this all agreed. And as the king spoke mildly and friendly with the bonds, their answer was appeased, and their conference with the king went off peacefully. At the close of it, a midsummer sacrifice was fixed to take place in Meran, and all chiefs and great bonds to attend it as usual. The king was to be honored. 73. Jarn's Keg or Iron Beard. There was a great bond called Skeg, and sometimes Jarn's Keg, or Iron Beard, who dwelt in Utlock. He spoke first at the thing to Olaf, and was the foremost man of the bonds in speaking against Christianity. The thing was concluded in this way for that time, the bonds returned home, and the king went to later. 74. The feast at later. King Olaf lay with his ships in the river Nid, and had 30 vessels, which were manned with many brave people. But the king himself was often at later, with his court attendants. As the time now was approaching at which the sacrifices should be made at Meran, the king prepared a great feast at later, and sent a message to the districts of Strand, Galardal, and out to Orkadal, to invite the chiefs and other great bonds. When the feast was ready, and the chiefs assembled, there was a handsome entertainment the first evening, at which plenty of liquor went round, and the guests were made very drunk. The night after they all slept in peace. The following morning, when the king was dressed, he had the early mass sung before him. And when the mass was over, ordered to sound the trumpets for a house thing, upon which all his men left the ships to come up to the thing. When the thing was seated, the king stood up, and spoke thus: "We held a thing at Gossa, and there I invited the bonds to allow themselves to be baptized. But they, on the other hand, invited me to offer sacrifice to their gods, as King Hakon, Athelstan's foster son, had done. And thereafter it was agreed upon between us that we should meet at Meran, and there make a great sacrifice. Now if I, along with you, shall turn again to making sacrifice, then will I make the greatest of sacrifices that are in use. And I will sacrifice men. But I will not select slaves or malefactors for this, but will take the greatest men only to be offered to the gods. And for this I select Ormygra of Medaldas, Sturthar of Gentler, Kar of Gritting, Asborn Thorbertson of Barnes, Orm of Ligsa, Helder of Skirting Steja. And besides these he named 5 others of the principal men. All these, he said, he would offer in sacrifice to the gods for peace and a fruitful season, and ordered them to be laid hold of immediately. Now when the bonds saw that they were not strong enough to make head against the king, they asked for peace, and submitted wholly to the king's pleasure. So it was settled that all the bonds who would come there should be baptized, and should take an oath to the king to hold by the right faith, and to renounce sacrifice to the gods. The king then kept all these men as hostages who came to his feast, until they strengthened their sons, brothers, or other near relations. 75. At the thing in Trondheim. King Olaf went in with all his forces into the Trondheim country. And when he came to Meran, all among the chiefs of the Trondheim people who were most opposed to Christianity were assembled, and had with them all the great bonds who had before made sacrifices at that place. There was thus a greater multitude of bonds than there had been at the Frosta thing. Now the king let the people be summoned to the thing, where both parties met armed. And when the thing was seated, the king made a speech, in which he told the people to go over to Christianity. Jarn's Keg replies on the part of the bonds, and says that the will of the bonds is now, as formerly, that the king should not break their laws. "We want, king," said he, "that thou shouldst offer sacrifice, as other kings before thee have done." All the bonds applauded his speech with a loud shout, and said he would have all things according to what Skeg said. Then the king said he would go into the temple of their gods with them, and see what the practices were when they sacrificed. The bonds thought well of this proceeding, and both parties went to the temple. 76. The Trondheim people baptized. Now King Olaf entered into the temple with some few of his men and a few bonds. And when the king came to where their gods were, Thor, as the most considered among the gods, sat there adorned with gold and silver. The king lifted up his gold-inlaid axe which he carried in his hands, and struck Thor so that the image rolled down from its seat. Then the king's men turned to and threw down all the gods from their seats. And while the king was in the temple, Jarn's keg was killed outside of the temple doors, and the king's men did it. When the king came forth out of the temple, he offered the bonds two conditions: that all should accept of Christianity forthwith, or that they should fight with him. But as Skegg was killed, there was no leader in the bonds army to raise the banner against King Olaf. So they took the other condition, to surrender to the king's will and obey his order. Then King Olaf had all the people present baptized, and took hostages sending for the remaining true to Christianity. And he sent his men round to every district, and no man in the Trondheim country opposed Christianity, but all people took baptism. 77. A town in the Trondheim country. King Olaf with his people went out to Nidaros, and made houses on the flat side of the river Nid, which he raised to be a merchant town, and gave people ground to build houses upon. The king's house he had built just opposite Skippercrock. And he transported thither, in harvest, all that was necessary for his winter residence, and had many people about him there. 78. King Olaf's marriage. King Olaf appointed a meeting with the relations of Jarn's keg, and offered them the compensation or penalty for his bloodshed.